A final assault on so-called outlaw groups. Ethiopia's Prime Minister is promising a swift end to his offensive on Tigray region. World leaders are calling for urgent mediation. So what will it take to resolve the conflict? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Khan. It's been 3 weeks since Ethiopia's government sent soldiers into Tigray. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and the Northern Region's government, the Tigray People's Liberation Front or TPLF, each say the other is illegitimate. Nobel Peace Prize winner Abiy has ordered his troops to carry out a final assault. Now, the TPLF's leader says artillery shells have struck the regional capital, Mekelle. Phone and internet connections are down, making it impossible to confirm reports of killings and atrocities. On Friday, Abiy Ahmed told African Union mediators he'll only speak to representatives he says are operating legally in Tigray. The government insists this doesn't mean the Prime Minister's rejecting talks to end the conflict. Now, the fighting has forced 43,000 people to seek refuge in neighbouring Sudan. The UN's High Commissioner for Refugees is calling for $150 million in donations. Hibba Morgan has more from a camp in Sudan.
Akuba refugee camp here in Sudan's Getachew state has expanded since it was first opened just over 2 weeks ago. Now, when it was first opened, it hosted about a few hundred Ethiopian refugees fleeing from the conflict in the Tigray region. Now, the camp hosts more than 7,000 Ethiopian refugees, and this place is becoming sort of a permanent shelter for them until things ease back home and they say it's safe for them to return. Now, this is the only formal refugee camp here in Getachew state, despite Sudan hosting more than 43,000 Ethiopian refugees over the past 3 weeks escaping from the conflict in the Tigray region. The other centers, Hamdayet Reception Center in neighboring Balsillie state and Lugdi here in Getachew state, are all just reception centers, including Village 8, which is about 30 kilometers from the Sudan-Ethiopia border that hosts more than 15,000 Ethiopian refugees. Now, most of them here stand under the scorching sun waiting for food aid and waiting for food distribution. But they say that this is much better than being back home, not knowing what they could have faced. Many families speak of leaving their loved ones behind, of witnessing people being slaughtered, of atrocities they say that forced them to flee and come here to Sudan seeking refuge. But aid organizations say that they need help in terms of responding to the influx of refugees. They say that in the coming 6 months, they expect up to 200,000 Ethiopian refugees to come here to Sudan seeking refuge from the Tigray region because of the conflict, should the fighting continue. They say that they need financial assistance or funding for the programs to be able to respond to this refugee crisis that is unfolding, because Sudan as a government, despite hosting them, already hosts nearly 1 million other refugees in various other states and therefore will not be able to cope with this crisis on its own. So while the aid organizations are sounding the alarm and calling for support to be able to respond to this current unfolding refugee crisis, people here say they'll wait to hear until things are safe before they go back home in Tigray region in Ethiopia.
Let's introduce our panel. In Ethiopia's capital, Addis Ababa, Samuel Getachew, a journalist at The Reporter. In Ontario, Canada, Anne Fitz-Gerald, director of the Balsillie School of International Affairs. She worked in Ethiopia for many years. And in Cambridge, UK, William Davison, a senior Ethiopia analyst at the International Crisis Group. A warm welcome to you all. Now, the Ethiopian government declined our request for a representative to join this discussion. In fact, what they did say is that they wouldn't appear on a panel that potentially could have a member of the Tigray People's Liberation Front calling them a terrorist group. I want to begin in Addis Ababa with Samuel Getachew. Are they a terrorist group?
Well, it depends on who you ask. That's a tricky question for me to answer. You have to consider the position I'm in. To declare them a terrorist and move on will be unbecoming of someone who works for a newspaper. And I would respectfully refuse to answer that question.
But can you just explain to us why the government might call them that?
Well, they're in a conflict. The Ethiopian government and the TPLF have been in conflict for a while. And this just moved on to a real conflict that's affecting thousands of people. If you hear the TPLF side, I'm sure they'll make the same kind of accusation. So it's just back and forth, and we've been watching it from a distance. And we've been, concerned where this was heading for a long time. And many of us are not surprised that it went this far to a conflict that's just killing so many of our fellow men and women.
Well, let's talk about mediation, Samuel. If there is this strong language being used, the sheer amount of people being displaced, accusations of war crimes being committed in Mekelle, all of this is going to put pressure on any kind of mediation to be successful, right?
The prime minister, you have to give them the benefit of the doubt. He's been saying from day one that he's given the TPLF leadership a chance, too many chances at mediation. We've watched it from a distance when Haile Gebrselassie, the Olympian, joined elders and went to Mekelle trying to bridge the gap between the two governments. It did not work. Many people were criticizing the prime minister for being slow in taking actions, not just in Mekelle or Tigray, but all across the country. People were dying in many parts of the country. In Oromia, they were dying, and many people wanted him to take action. People felt he was being too soft in his reaction to what was happening in Ethiopia. What happened in Mekelle, it was, we watched it for a year when they were going back and forth, and we were concerned, and many of us knew this was going to happen. We just didn't think it was going to be this fast it has become too big even to control it. And I think it's too late for mediation. The prime minister has said it a few times. And they're just in Mekelle now. They're fighting among themselves, the TPLF and the Ethiopian side. And he said it will conclude in a few days, and we hope that will happen. But personally, I don't believe in conflicts. I grew up in Canada, a very peaceful nation. We believed in dialogue, mediation, and all kinds of stuff. And I've traveled to the Tigray region, and I've met many of these people. I'm not saying the TPLF, I'm saying everyday people from Tigray. They happen to be very peaceful, and to see them suffer is just as heartbreaking as you can find anywhere in the world. And we're just so sad, and people are just dying left and right. And the refugees in the Sudan, the stories they're telling us, that's so scary. I don't blame the UN Human Rights Commissioner when she said there's some essence of war crimes happening in Tigray. I really think something is happening, and we can't wait to go and see what really happened and start the conversation.
Well, let's bring in Anne Fitz-Gerald here. She's in Waterloo, Ontario. And one of the things that's is crucial to this conversation is the fact that Prime Minister Ahmed has actually said that he's only going to talk to people that he thinks represent the people of that region, of Tigray region. What does that mean? Is he picking and choosing the people that he can negotiate with? Are they just his own people?
I think what it means is that there's a question of legitimacy in his eyes, but equally there's a question of legitimacy in the other party's eyes as well. And this is the gray space in between both positions that people are trying to analyze, people are trying to navigate through. The Prime Minister feels that an illegal election went forward in Tigray without the proper constitutional authority. He has, in his view, made efforts to engage in dialogue with the party. In his view, those efforts have failed and not been fruitful. And, I think it's important to recognize here that mediation is a process by which a third party is brought in to facilitate discussions and to seek to resolve a dispute. But it's a process which comes by invitation only, and it's a process which addresses a dispute. And I think we can all agree that this is beyond what is classified as a dispute now. This is a full-out conflict. And, there's a lot of gray space in between those two goalposts.
Now, in Cambridge, William Davison, obviously these things don't happen in a vacuum. There have been issues with the federal government and with Tigray state between them for many years now. But what was the real spark for this conflict? Why did this happen 3 weeks ago?
Well, the final trigger for the conflict was an incident on the night of November the 3rd, November the 4th, where the federal government describes it as an attack by forces on the federal military. Ultimately, what seems to have happened is that the Tigrayan forces, the Tigrayan leadership, believing that there was about to be a federal intervention, they have forcefully taken over elements of the military. This really is the final trigger that led to the federal government military intervention. Going back, as your other guests have described, we have this process where Tigray ran an election against, in defiance of federal rulings. Therefore, the federal government said that Tigray's government was illegitimate and unlawful. In turn, Tigray's government said that the federal government no longer had legal authority after the original expiry of its term in early October. And this was due to an election that was delayed because of the pandemic. So it was really this constitutional dispute, if we go a little bit further back, that authorized the federal government, in its eyes, to intervene to correct this situation in the region. Of course, we can go back further to 2018 and the change of power, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's arrival. And after that, Tigray's ruling party, they lost a lot of federal power, and they sort of ended up with their power focused at the regional level. This was accompanied by a lot of bitterness, allegations from the federal government that Tigray's leadership was destabilizing Ethiopia by sponsoring conflict, allegation from Tigray's leadership that the federal government was scapegoating them and their party for acts of destabilization or for all sorts of abuses and corruption that they said had a broader responsibility across the Ethiopian ruling coalition. So, it's a dispute that goes some way back. We could go further back into the history of Tigray ruling parties, the era of predominance during the federal era since the early 90s. And we could go even further back into Ethiopian history to explain some of the roots of this conflict as well.
Well, let me bring in Samuel Getachew here. Let's bring it right up to date. So are we at a stage now where the federal government was afraid that Tigray was going to become a breakaway nation? Was that what was driving the government?
That might as well be. The Tigray state decided to hold an election when it was told it was against the constitution of the land. They've been openly debating about independence. What's a federal government if it can't even keep its nation intact? That's one of the many reasons what provoked this conflict, including the attacks on the military site in Mekelle. So, there are many, many reasons what provoked it. Myself and William, and we watched it in Addis Ababa when this was just moving forward. And the conversation started very peacefully. I remember when Davison, the head of the TPLF, stood behind the prime minister in 2018 when he became prime minister and made all of us so excited about this new Ethiopia. They were trying to build the peaceful transfer of power we've been watching from a distance in other countries was beginning to happen in Ethiopia. But in the last year, something happened in Ethiopia that we can't even begin to understand. It was no longer a conversation. It was just about, one side showing power and the back and forth that was going on between the prime minister and the head of the TPLF, the jokes that were being made, the propagandas that were being told in government TVs was just so overwhelmingly disappointing for many of us who've been watching Ethiopia. And we've wanted, I grew up in an era of the Ethiopian famine, and we really wanted it to succeed. And we watched it from near and far, and we're not surprised that it became this. Something that my own generation and the generation before me have been watching. You have to know the Tigray state has been at war for a long, long time. It was beginning to have peace. The Ethiopian famine of 1985 happened in the Tigray state. I've toured the whole, almost the whole part of the Tigray state. It's the poorest. It's as poor as it gets, even by Ethiopian standard. And to see it in this state is a failed leadership, not just by our leaders, by all of us, I think.
And Fitz-Gerald, is there any strong evidence that might suggest that Tigray was about to break away, and that's why this happened?
About to break away in terms of seceding?
About to become a breakaway state, a breakaway nation, declare independence?
Well, there was definitely posturing and positioning towards something, some sort of recognition, whether it was an asymmetrical federalist posture that they were vying for, whether it was some negotiations that brought in the international community, whether it was efforts to break away, we are not sure. But what we are sure about was that there was a gradual pulling back of governance capacity, Tigrayan representatives and Tigrayan governance capacity from Addis Ababa to the regional capital. So we saw that exodus and that increased focus on the region. We saw lots of news coming from the region about economic development priorities and the propaganda and the snubs against the federal government hit an all-time high. So we just aren't sure about the plans. We aren't sure about the intentions. The electricity and the internet blackout in the region, particularly around the area where the conflict is being carried out, make proper, well-informed analysis very, very difficult at the moment. And we've seen this conflict take on another trajectory, one that is all about an information war, with disinformation and misinformation being thrown around on an hourly basis. And this is having a very divisive and polarizing effect on the people. We've always lived in an era of disinformation, but in the age of social media, this disinformation has now hit a crescendo, which is playing havoc with 110 million lives in Ethiopia.
William Davison, let me bring you in here. Let's talk mediation now. If Abiy Ahmed is right, the Prime Minister, then Mekele should fall to Ethiopian forces within the next few days. They then have to hold it. That's an occupation, as we've seen in many other countries. If there's an occupation, there's generally an insurgency. Are you concerned that there will be an insurgency in Mekele?
Yes, there's certainly a possibility that this phase of what has essentially been conventional war for the last 3.5 weeks, there's certainly a possibility that as the Tigrayan forces lose control of major urban areas, as they have done so far, and then possibly finally the regional capital, they could transform their resistance into more of an insurgency type of operation. There is a long history of that type of resistance to imposed rule in Tigray. That is certainly a possibility. There is also a possibly, a bigger, more consequential question coming up, which is there will be an imposed federal provisional administration that the federal government will try and put in place in Tigray after it has achieved its objectives of removing Tigray's leadership. Because this has been imposed from the outside, and because there is this issue of autonomy and dispute over the election, the regional election that 2.7 million Tigrayans voted in, there is a question about what level of support and quite possibly resistance there will be from the general population to the federal government's plans in Tigray. The point here is that, first of all, we have to see what the course of this conflict is. It looks like the federal forces will be in control of Mekele. Then we will have to see what sort of insurgency, if any, develops. And then there will be a question about how to govern Tigray if there ends up being quite significant popular resistance to any imposed government. These are the reasons why, despite the justifications the federal government has for the military intervention, why it is necessary to look beyond that and at some form of political solution, some sort of settlement for Tigray, where these autonomy questions will be addressed, and to look beyond that, because otherwise it is hard to see a sustainable, peaceful settlement in Tigray. And instead, we could see, in one form or another, some form of continuing instability.
Samuel Getachew, you've heard what our guest William Davison just had to say there. It's going to be very difficult for any mediation to take place if there is this occupation, in effect, by Ethiopian military forces, and then this imposed rule by the federal government. Do you think Prime Minister Ahmed has bitten off more than he can chew?
I remember when during George W. Bush, when the American troops went to Baghdad, I remember the mission accomplished. He had a big background. I remember when they started going around after doing what they have done, whichever side you are, it was violent what happened in Iraq. I remember when they started handing out candies to try to connect with the locals. It did not work. There needs to be an adult conversation that should happen between the federal government and the state of Tigray. Ethiopia needs to begin to understand they have misgivings about his leadership, perhaps, and even what's happening in Ethiopia. There has to be some kind of adult conversation if Ethiopia is really going to be moving forward, or if it is deciding to go backward to the era of TPLF, which I obviously hated. There was no human rights. Lack of democracy wasn't even a discussion. And I mean, they've done developmental stuff. It's good. They tried to make Ethiopia like China. Sure, that was their choice. Some people love it, some people don't. But the fact is, an adult conversation has to happen sooner than later, or the Ethiopia that we know will forever disappear.
And Fitz-Gerald, can there be an adult conversation between two sides that have just gone through this? In fact, is it not just an adult conversation? I mean, can even mediation begin anytime soon?
Well, I think there were efforts to start a mediation process. In fact, the African Union chairperson days ago announced how delighted he was that Ethiopia had agreed to the appointment of 3 envoys and had agreed to their role in mediating between the two parties. The problem was, on the Ethiopian side of the government, we heard that this had not been agreed to. So it does beg the question of what role these 3 envoys will have moving forward. Will it simply be a role of interlocutor between the Ethiopian government and the African Union? It is true that African leaders are very skilled at mediation and dialogue processes. So too is the African Union and IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, also located in Addis Ababa. But what sort of process goes forward is in question. On the Ethiopian government side, they regard this, what they call TPLF junta group, as criminals. And they feel that there is no place for a group that committed treasonous crimes at the negotiating or mediation table. That said, I think what is paramount is to hear the voice of the Tigrayan people and to make some decisions on who the stakeholders will be at whatever table we have moving forward. Dialogue table, facilitation table, mediation table. Who will be the stakeholders representing the voice of the Tigrayan people? And also, I think it's important to remember that Ethiopia's close partnerships with different members of the international community moving forward will be important. And I think what will be important to those partners is to see clarity on the information that has been suppressed and blocked by way of information and telecommunication blackouts. So whether or not the international community may have a role in helping with the verification of those details, the assessment of those details, the reporting of those details moving forward may be another option.
I want to thank all our guests, Samuel Getachew, Anne Fitz-Gerald and William Davison. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the whole team here in Doha, bye for now.